Hi, and welcome to the Digital Accessibility Podcast, sponsored by PCR Digital, who provide people-centric recruitment. I'm Joe. I'm a senior technical recruitment consultant and a huge advocate for digital accessibility. Throughout the series, I'm interviewing thought leaders and professionals within the accessibility space to get their thoughts and advice on how we can all work together to create a more accessible digital world. I hope you find this resource insightful and interesting, and as enjoyable as I find it speaking to my amazing guests. So as always, sit back, relax, and I really hope you enjoy the chat. Today I'm joined by Jeremy Grandstaff, who is the Vice President of Business Development at CurbCutOS. CurbCutOS is a team of disabled-led accessibility advocates with over 29 years of combined experience. Since 2019, their commitment to people with disabilities has fueled their drive to create digital experiences that empower, inspire, and include everyone. So welcome to the podcast, Jeremy.
Well, thank you, Joe. I'm so excited to be guesting for you on your podcast. When I listened to your podcast, I never imagined that we would be here. So that's really exciting to me. And good morning from the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so grateful for all the time in the lead up to this as well. And the chats that we've had, it's been great getting to know you a bit better. So I'm hoping that our listeners will get to know you too and what you do at CurbCut. So you initially got in touch, like you've mentioned there, after discovering this podcast as a bit of a platform for advocacy and giving a voice to the experts in digital accessibility. So I'm pleased that it's being heard across the pond, as we would say. But yeah, so you've introduced me to what CurbCutOS do. So I'm hoping that you could share a bit more with our listeners who might not be as aware of you as a company.
Well, absolutely, Joe, and thanks again for the opportunity. I always find that starting with numbers makes people happy. I'm not sure why, because for me, I kind of get, excited about other things. But according to the Center for Disease Control, there are 1 out of 4 people in the US that have a disability. You take that worldwide, that's approximately 1.85 billion people in the world with a disability. That's bigger than China, just to put that into context.
Yeah.
But what it really led me to start looking at was, what are we losing, right? When we put this into dollars, there's $13 trillion worth of disposable income that those 1.85 people have at their fingertips. And ironically, you and I were just talking, and that's approximately $7,000 per person that they could spend at websites. And if those websites are not accessible to people, they're going to take their business elsewhere. So everybody always says, what's the business case? That's the business case for what we do, right? Now, CurbCutOS, we have our name because we want to do for digital accessibility what the curb cut effect did for physical accessibility. And some people really understand that and other people don't. So I'm going to give an extra sentence on that, right? That really what we're talking about is curb cuts were developed for people in wheelchairs. And now we see moms with strollers using them to get into the street and to make street crossings without having to pick their strollers up and take them over the curb. We see people on bicycles using curb cuts in order to be able to get into the street and to be able to ride on the street. And so curb cut takes a very holistic approach to digital accessibility. Of course, we do aggregated audits, and aggregated audits are a combination of looking at the user experience, and doing an audit of user experience, an audit of the accessibility on a website with our automated audit tool, but also with a manual audit to make sure that we're catching with all those, with our impact, 60% more errors than most companies are catching in this space. Of course, we do design reviews and remediation services and training. It's really about a holistic approach to your digital accessibility journey. And it's about looking at how we can improve your bottom line as a company.
Yeah, amazing. I will jump in there. So obviously, being that we're across the pond from one another, so a curb cut over here, we would call it a dropped curb.
I wondered about that when I was prepping today. I'm like, I wonder if they call it that over there. So yes.
So yeah, so there you go. So if you're coming to the UK or the British market, then yeah, maybe yeah. I mean, it's good to just sort of say, right, okay, so drop curve, like, but you've explained it beautifully there, so that's fine. And it's like you say, I think that really it kind of speaks to the needs of digital accessibility, not just for people with disabilities, but also temporary or situational quote unquote disabilities that people may have. So, like you said, a mother using a stroller. Or a pram. I promise I won't translate everything.
No, I think it's great, and I think it's one of the things, and I'll tell you that curb cut effect. That's what actually caught my attention when I heard my boss Mark Pound first talk about that. I was like, whoa! And what really impacted me is to think about, I'm a blind guy. Right. And so obviously accessibility, and we'll talk about this more, but accessibility is important to me because it's how I've had to do my job. Right. But when you think about digital accessibility, it's not just for someone who can't hear or for someone who can't see. It's thinking about everything from, what do the flashing ads across your screen do to someone that has a seizure disorder? How does it impact someone who is neurodiverse when your site is so confusing that they just get lost in it? And by the way, that's an impact that comes across to everybody, not just someone that's neurodiverse, but using that lens, we're going to see that. Is the language on your website really inviting and inclusive to people? And I saw someone's, I'm not even going to call out the name, but I saw someone's website that their language that they were using, I'm not even a person of color, but when I read it, I was like, oh gosh, no. Right. And that is a level of accessibility that I think, really helps to illustrate the holistic impact of digital accessibility and what that looks like, whether you have a seen or an unseen disability.
Absolutely. And I think that it shouldn't, I think we live in an age where everyone wants to define everything, give everything a label. And I kind of purposefully didn't introduce you as a blind man, because I don't think that's what defines you as a person. I mean, it's not prevented us from doing anything in our calls leading up to this. And, that's thanks to your ability to navigate well with the systems that you use to do your job and to have these calls and things. So I don't think it should define you as a person, that one thing. There's so much more about you, Jeremy, and yeah, we're going to get to learn a lot more about that now, so that's great. So that's the second question, I guess, if we can move on to that one, is if you could share your journey of navigating the digital world as a blind person, and how that's shaped your perspective even further, from your own lived experience.
Yeah, and this was a really interesting question for me as I was thinking through this, right? And really looking at this. You may find it interesting to know that usually, up until I took this job, I was the only blind guy in the room, or one of few, right? And so this is the first job that I've ever actually had where me being blind is an asset, in what I can do and how I can talk about my own personal experience and bring it back to my job, right? And before, I always felt myself kind of, I don't want to say running from it, but really making sure that people understood that blindness was just a part of my being. It did not define me, right?
Yeah.
But as I was actually coming back and looking at this and thinking about my own journey, I'm a small town boy. I grew up in a little town called Marengo, Ohio, which is about 45 minutes north of the capital of Ohio, Columbus, Ohio being one of our states here in the US. There was no public transportation. I mean, I grew up in a town of 200 people at the most, right?
Wow.
We lived in the country, about 3.5 miles out of town. So as a blind kid, I rode my bike around everywhere. I used to end up with little cuts on my fingers. I remember being 6 years old and coming in from riding my bike in the morning, and I had like these little cuts going across my fingers from where I had scraped a mailbox on the way by, right? We lived on a gravel road, so there wasn't any traffic. There was just mailboxes, right?
Yeah.
When I was 7, my dad and I figured out a way to put beepers on the 3 barrels that are in a barrel race for horses. And so I would listen to the beepers and I would zone in on the beepers, and that's how I would run the barrels. It's kind of yeah, I'm sure those of you who may not be in horses, it's just a pattern of barrels that you do circles around. And so I used to do that. And I remember being 7 years old and hearing my dad have a conversation with someone because they felt that me having those beepers on the barrels was me cheating, right? And I remember thinking that that was really weird. I came up to public school. I went to the Ohio State School for the Blind until I was 9, I think, and 9 or 10. And I came up to public school in 6th grade. And this is a story that I've actually been talking about a lot, Joe, because this is 1988 when I came up to public school. There was no process for me to come up to public school. There was no process of how I was going to get my books and how I was going to be able to do assignments and be able to, quote unquote, assimilate into the normal of, going to public school. And I, at the age of 9 or 10, worked with my new teachers to create that process. That's kind of fascinating if you think about it.
Yeah.
When I went to college in 1994, I know I'm dating myself totally with this little journey we're taking, but when I went to college in 1994, I always think about this, right? When I went to college for my undergrad, they were just getting to the point where they would start defining what does it look like if you have an ADA need, right? And so I distinctly remember staying up all night in the first 2 weeks of classes and scanning all of my books because it was easier than trying to wait for the Disability Services Office to get me all of my books on tape, right?
Jeez, yeah.
When I went to grad school, and I say scanning, by the way, because for the first time in my life, I had actually found this scanner program that had OCR. And I was like, oh my God, I can just scan all my books and they're right there.
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah.
And so rather than trying to explain that to the Disability Services Office, I just stayed up and scanned my own books.
Oh.
Right. When I went to grad school in 2002, 2003, this will show you how much things had advanced. They were now scanning my books for me. And Disability Services would do it. Right. So, but when I went to undergrad, I had to develop that process and had to figure out, my friends would be like, why were you at the computer lab all night long? Well, I was scanning my books. Wow, that seems weird. Why do you do that? Why doesn't someone do it for you? Because it was easier for me to do it myself, right? Yeah. So I spent 25 years of my career, like I said, being the only blind person in the room. And literally I know this is the longest part of our journey, but I I used to facilitate, well, I probably still do, I should say, but I facilitate rooms of people. And many times in the conversations that I'm having, because I did a lot of collaborative planning, collaborative training work, right? So there's stuff that people are putting up on the wall on flip charts. And everybody, like, I remember standing up in the front of the room one time getting ready for a thing, and I heard somebody in the back of the room go, "Oh my God, he's a blind guy. How's he going to know what we're putting on the wall?" Well, there's an interesting piece, and I'll make sure to get you this link, Joe, but I wrote about this on LinkedIn. I don't, sometimes you'll see facilitators, they'll look around the room and they'll go, "So what I'm seeing on the flip charts are," I don't do that, right? Instead, I have everybody put their stuff up on flip charts. We take a break. Everybody goes and votes. And the first 6 people that are done voting, I ask to come see me. And their job is to go around, circle the big votes, right? The big vote getter items. And when we come back as a whole group, they report those items out. Right. What we seen in our vote is blah, blah, blah. And there's an irony that if every facilitator would take that approach, they would be able to inspire people, because it's the people giving the results to their own people rather than me as an outsider giving those results. And so I always looked at what are ways that I can empower others to lead, but at the same time address my own disability problem, right? And be able to do that, right? And so when I took the job with CurbCut, and I'll just own my own vulnerability on your podcast, one of the things that I've had to learn is that it's absolutely imperative in my job now that I be able to publicly and comfortably talk about me being the blind guy and what that looks like and how that impacts my world. Because for the first time in my life, I am in a job where I can now go back to the companies that I have fought against for 25 years and said, "Man, I wish you were more accessible." And now I can say, all these conversations that I said, "I wish you'd fix your accessibility problems," I now work for a company that can help you do that directly. How can I help you?
Oh,
and
amazing.
So so
that's just beautiful for it to come full circle. But it's unfortunate that is the experience that you've had, and in so many ways, and it's not just yourself, of course, as well, that has to deal with that. And being that I'm within recruitment, and I have candidates and people that go out and do contract work for me that also have disabilities of their own, and it's the sometimes reluctance of the end client, or they just don't even have that question, is there anything we can do to make sure that you can perform at your job to the best of your ability? You don't even have to sort of single out disability in a way. You just have to, I know the terminology reasonable adjustments and things like that, some people are uncomfortable with, because of course it should be reasonable. Do you know what I mean?
You would think, yes.
It's like, oh, you can't do your job because of X. That's a shame. It's like, it's not, it's just ridiculous, I think. But I really appreciate you sharing that journey with me and the audience, Jeremy. I know that, sometimes it's not, you don't want to overly disclose and things like that, but that really helps us to sort of understand from your perspective as well what you've had to go through and overcome. And great that you now have the opportunity to go back to them and be like, do you know what? I'll just show you how to do things the right way.
Exactly. It's so much fun. I love it.
It's almost like revenge, but in the best and most wholesome kind of way.
Well, I always say, Joe, like, ever since when I started my career, right, and even before I came to the job that I have now, my mission has always been, I want to empower people by giving them the tools and the techniques that they need to be most successful. And when I did collaborative planning or collaborative learning, that's what it was about. right? How many times have we sat in a training where people just talk at us for an hour and we say, oh, wow, that was amazing. And we don't do anything with it. Right. And so my approach was, we're going to teach you for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and then we're going to put you to work and actually give you an opportunity to practice it. Right. And what that looks like. Now it's like I get to look at people and I get to say, you know what? You and I had several conversations about how you can make your products more accessible, but I now have a path and a tool that you can use to actually do that. Let me help you.
Love
Right.
that.
And so.
No, it's amazing. Brilliant. And then, so I guess that brings us on to the next part, which is to sort of get to know from you what are some of the most common accessibility barriers that you would face online or at work, and how, if you've got any sort of suggestions of how they could or should be addressed, if there's anything that, you know, immediate that the listeners or myself can start to put into practice, that'd be great.
Yeah, this is a fun question for me as well, right? Because I've always been this person who I really didn't have a choice. I just kind of had to make it work, right? For I always worked for companies that were smaller or even owned my own company for about 20 years. And so there wasn't this ability that I had where I could be like, you will make this accessible or else I can't do my job. I would have lost my job.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think the first piece, talking to the end user, if you will, is be very careful. Because as I look back and I think about this, my desire to try to work around an accessibility problem would cost me time, which impacts my money. And so that's the first thing to really think about. And I actually want to give a little props to my friend Rob, who was working with me when I owned my own business. And I remember he said, how long did it take you to fix that website problem? I was like, probably an hour and a half. And he goes, Jeremy, you're the CEO of a company. You shouldn't be spending an hour and a half trying to fix a problem that somebody else could have fixed in 20 minutes. And I was like, yes, but just because I'm a blind person doesn't mean I don't have the ability to fix it. And his response to me, I thought, was amazing, right? Because he goes, I never said you didn't have the ability to fix it. I said spending an hour and 20 minutes of your time doing it is probably not the best use of your time at a CEO level. And I thought, that's fascinating to me, right? I had never thought about that. And so really thinking about from an end user perspective, it's not just can you do it or can't you do it? It's how much time is it going to take you to do it? And if you empower someone else on your team to do it, can they do it in less time, which would make you more effective and efficient in the role that you have? So that's the first piece, right? I always kind of jokingly say, there are times when the biggest barrier for me has been my own stubbornness. Right. And the idea that I want to prove I'm an independent blind guy, right? So I think we have to be careful of that. But to your question directly, shopping carts that aren't accessible, I think are probably one of the biggest barriers. And we just talked about this when I opened. $13 trillion or $7,000 a person for someone who is disabled. That is money that they have to spend. Why would you want to be a company who doesn't get that money? Right? Like that. I just don't understand that for me. Right? I struggle with that. No alt tags. Or my personal favorite, undescriptive alt tags. And I think about a post that I saw on LinkedIn the other day in a group that I'm part of. I'm trying to keep this generic and not call the group out. But it was a model that someone had posted. in their post, they didn't talk about the model. They just said, oh my gosh, doesn't this model really show us how XXX? And the alt tag for the model that they had posted as the picture said a model.
Oh no.
And I was like, okay. And so I took it, I ran it through, I used JAWS, and JAWS has a great image AI function, right? Where it runs it through ChatGPT and I think Claude or something like that. And it gives you the description, right? So I ran it through the AI image interpreter, if you will, and posted in the comments, I just wanted you to know, here's a better alt tag for your chart that you put in this post. But what I found fascinating is when I looked at the interpretation of JAWS of that chart, it actually told me enough about the model that I could internalize the model. And I remember that model like it's in my head every day because and there was an irony, by the way, when I posted that someone came back and was like, oh my gosh, do we really have to be so specific with our alt tags? And I thought, this is a group that's talking about emotional intelligence. We absolutely do, right? So I see a number of posts like that, or even a number of websites. You know, one of the things that I am really keen on is making sure that even CurbCut's website and social media and things like that is always representing what we talk about. You know, I call it walking the walk or talking the talk, right? If you're going to say accessibility is important to you, if you're going to talk about DEI or inclusion, then please make sure that your alt tags and your posts are written and display in a way that's going to bring everybody else into it. And, you know, as I've gotten further into the field, I've also been thinking about what we don't know. And I'm just going to leave you with a quick thought on this one.
Yeah, sure.
So before Joe and I started recording today, to the listeners, we were talking about The Crown, right? And a show that my family has just become infatuated with. And I remember, this is about 3 years ago. I'm ashamed to tell you, Joe, I came late to the audio description party. Okay. I had saw this audio description version of the movie Pretty Woman, and I remember Pretty Woman at the time was a really favorite movie of mine. And after seeing the audio description, I was really kind of disappointed because I thought the scene showed a lot more. You know, remember I was a 14-year-old boy, right? So, but we're watching The Crown, me and my husband, and we get through like the first 3 episodes. My husband's like, I can't watch anymore. And I was like, why? This is so great. I love it. Right. And he goes, because there is so much stuff that is happening that it's just too hard to tell you what's going on. And I was like, well, everybody talks about this audio description. Maybe we should turn it on. And I got to tell you something. We ended up going back and watching the first 3 episodes, and have now watched the whole thing a couple times. And it's because of the audio description. I did not even think about some of the things that they would tell me, some of the looks that you would see between the characters, right? Where I was like, oh, wow. Right. And I'll tell you, 3 years later, audio description is on everything in our house, not just for me, but because my husband can now look at his phone and not have to look at the TV all the time to see what's going on, because audio description tells him that, right? But it really got me thinking about, what did I not know that was happening, right? Like, I've learned a lot more about the looks that we give each other because I've listened to how people are giving those looks in shows that I may be watching with the audio description. And I better understand like there's a joke sometimes in my house where I'll be like, and Jeremy raised his eyebrows in disgust, right? And it's funny because until I actually saw that on audio description, it never even occurred to me that I was raising my eyebrows, and I was, right?
Yeah.
So just I think that's the big thing. So I hope that helps to address that question.
I adore that. I love that so much. It's so fun. It's great, and it's amazing, and it's a similar thing in our household. So we always have captions on.
Mm.
I so my fiance, she's had a perforated eardrum for her whole life, and it was sorted, so her hearing is fine. Mine
Mm-hmm.
is not great. It's fine, but it's something that I'm getting looked into at the moment. But it's not for that. It's just because it's so busy. Sometimes I'm just like, oh, I can't actually get. Maybe there's an accent, maybe they're speaking too quickly. But if I could, or they're speaking in scientific language, and I'm like, what's that word? And then at least it's spelled out for me so I can Google it. So in a different sort of scenario, the captions help me to sort of ingest that sort of additional stuff as well.
Well, and
Um,
I think you're making a really good point, right? How many times watch people?
mm.
This is coming from a blind guy. That's the irony right there, right? But watch people, and you can watch them scrolling through videos, and they don't have the sound on, and it's because they can watch the captions,
Yeah, yeah.
right? And if they really want to know what's being said, they can watch the captions, assuming, by the way, that they're turned on.
Of course. No, that's great. I mean, and I've spoken to some amazing people that do some great work in audio description here in the UK, and yeah, definitely. I mean, if I'll definitely try and put them in touch with you, because if there's ever anything that you need any assistance with, then they're the pros. So yeah, I love that. I love that you've sort of now come full circle, come round to that, and you're like, okay, now you're getting that experience that you probably have denied yourself for a
Well,
bit
I
of a
will
longer period
tell
of time.
you, there sometimes can be a bad aspect to this. So we watched for the first time a scary movie with audio description last
Oh God.
Sunday. And I got to tell you something, Joe. I sat there for half an hour afterwards, like, oh my God. Oh my
Oh.
God, that was crazy. What and it, my partner and I were talking, and he's like, you know what? You should go back and watch Poltergeist. And I'm like, I don't think I have the capacity to do that right now. Right? Like that's or Session 9 is one of my favorites, but I just don't know that I could handle that on audio description. That may just be way too much. Because the movie we watched wasn't that scary, but
Oh
it had
God.
me freaked out.
Yeah. You're
So
just getting the access to all that extra stuff that you might not have
yeah.
thought of as well.
Yep.
Oh, amazing. Perfect. So question 4 is what are some of the things that you've asked for from a hirer to make sure that your work life is as close to barrier free as possible? And what can companies be doing to make the workplace more inclusive for people with visual impairments or who are blind?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the first thing I want to do is talk to the end user. Your job is to ask, their job is to say yes or no. If you don't ask, you never give them an opportunity to say yes or no.
Mm.
And that's really critical, right? Um, and I want to create a pause for that, right?
Yeah.
That if we don't ask, they will never be able to say yes or no. And there's an irony, by the way. That's the same thing we teach recruiters, and it's the same thing we teach salespeople. If you don't
Mm.
ask, they can't say yes or no. That's your job, right? So
Yeah.
for the end user, that's it. Now, when I was thinking about my own experience, I had and I've seen companies who do this well, and I've seen companies who don't. I'll just be honest with that about that. I'm not going to call out the ones who don't do it well by name.
They might become new clients of CurbCut. So
I hope they do one day. But when I was recruiting, for the time that I was recruiting, we were using a software I'm not going to also call out, but we're using this software and completely inaccessible to me.
Mm.
Like to the point where I had figured out workarounds, and then I walked in one morning and they had done an update to their software, and nothing was accessible anymore.
Oh God.
And I remember, this is one of those companies that like I literally went back and forth for probably 3, 4, 5 weeks. And at some point I said, either you are going to sit down and work with me on this, or my next step is to either call a lawyer and personally find out what I can do, or I'm going to publicly admonish you.
Mm.
And there was an interesting piece where the company that I worked for actually told me that if I ever talked like that to a vendor again, that they would fire me. Right.
Jeez.
And so I've never been one to back down from taking a stand, especially when it comes to me being able to do my job. And I wasn't in a position where I could say, well, either this gets fixed or I can't do my job, because they would have said, well, fine, we'll find somebody else. Right. And I know, just for those who are thinking it in the US, yes, there's a borderline discrimination thing here. And I get that that's a legal discrimination thing. Yes, I did talk to a lawyer, and no, it wasn't a suit that anybody would take on. Right. And so sometimes that's how the world is. And so what I did in that particular situation is I still went back to the company, to our vendor, if you will. And I said, all I'm asking you to do is sit down and find out what the problem is.
Yeah.
And once I got them to do a Zoom, I think it was a Zoom call or a Teams call, I showed them what was happening. Then they're like, oh my God, we don't even know how to fix that, but we want to. And so again, your job is to ask. They can say yes or no. And sometimes that also means that you have to, my friend Kate, we'll call out Miss Kate. She used to say, Jeremy, 30% of your job is managing the people who work for you, 40% of your job is doing your job, and the other 30% is managing the people you work for. And so, yes, there are times, just as I had to do in that particular case with the vendor, where I had to sit my boss down and say, you're wrong, and I'm fighting this battle. And what I need you to do is I need you to just reply all and say, this is a big problem for us, and we'd like you to prioritize it. And once she did that, they listened to me. Right. And so sometimes it is about teaching and educating. And though as people with disabilities, we don't like to teach and educate, we just wish everybody got it. Sometimes that's your job. Right. LinkedIn, when I used it as a recruiter. And yes, I'm totally calling out LinkedIn because I want this addressed. Right. But it's a simple thing. When you go to someone's profile, there is no heading one thing where their name is. And so it would take me probably 7 keystrokes to find someone's name so that I could call them by name, right? It's an easy fix. So that's why I called it out, right? But, learning how to work within those systems and how to find workarounds is amazing, right? If you can do that, then those are things you can teach other people. Like I said, I've seen some companies do it really well. When I started working for IBM, for example, this is my first job too. I had to go get a new seeing eye dog. And IBM actually gave me what they called personal business time. It means I was paid while I was getting my new dog and taking that 3 weeks off. You want to talk about an investment in an employee?
Yeah.
And how wonderful that made me feel. I've also worked for a company, by the way, who said, well, if you're going to go get a new dog, you're going to have to make sure that you can still do your job while you're gone.
Oh
That's unrealistic, right? So it comes down to 3 things to kind of finalize this particular question. As I said before, you got to walk the walk. If you're a company that you prioritize diversity, don't come back and then say, well, you're going to have to, you're not going to be able to fight the battle for accessibility, because diversity and inclusion also includes accessibility. Bringing curiosity and understanding. Don't look at accommodations as, oh my God, we have to do this. Oh my God, this is terrible. How are we going to make this work? But be curious. Tell me more about how you do your job. How can we help me understand that's a weird way to say that. Help me understand my knowledge of the tools that it takes to do your job. How can I best support you?
Yeah.
Right. One of the things that I did when I was a recruiter is, and it was one of those situations where I worked for a company who said, "Oh, we care about diversity. Oh, we want to employ people who are minorities. We want to employ people who have disabilities." And so one of the things that I did from a recruiter's perspective is I started asking before I would book the interview with someone, right? Is there any accommodations that you need during the process? And I would do it as part of the conversation, not on a form where they could check yes or no, but I'd specifically ask, hey, before we decide on a time, I just want to ask, do you have any accommodations that I can assist you with during the interview process? And it was fascinating to me because it opened the door. It made it okay for people to ask for the accommodations that they need. It demonstrated that culture of belonging that we were trying to create. And there was an irony that even somebody who didn't need an accommodation said, I really love that you asked that question. That shows me that your company is focused on DEI and creating a 21st century workplace.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I love that. And it's something, as you know, part of my job, and it's something that I've done from day one, partly because I work with digital accessibility roles, but also because that's kind of part of our culture, really, at PCR Digital. It is very much about, getting the best out of people and getting the best for people. So it's a simple thing to ask, and it says an awful lot, I think, in return, doesn't it?
yeah, it really does.
Oh, amazing. Brilliant. So next question 5. Is there any advice that you'd give to companies or individuals who want to make their digital content more inclusive, but don't actually know where to start?
That is a great question, Joe. And I have to tell you, yes, my boss would be very upset at me if I didn't start this question by saying contacting me so that I can find out if CurbCutOS is the right partner with you to start on this this digital accessible journey, right? But notice even in the way that I said that, I want to make sure it's not that I want to tell you, oh, great, we're perfect, we can do this for you. It's that I want to see if we're the right partner.
Yeah.
And if we're not, I'm going to hook you up with someone who is, right? But I think there's also a few things that you can start with. And some of this I've already mentioned, so I'll try to keep it brief. But alt tag your images and don't use chart as an alt tag description, right? Really look at your pictures that are on your website or on your social media. Are you putting an alt tag in those so that people who are not able to see those pictures really know what you're talking about? And I'll even say, take that a step further. If you're posting videos, do you have captions in those videos? Right? That's what we're talking about. You take those things, and that's a big win just to begin with, right? So you do alt tags and captions. I think that those are critical. And by the way, let's just be clear, those are going to connect with everybody, not just people who are blind and deaf. I think the next piece that I always tell people is think about your clients or your patrons. Okay, so do you understand what their user experience is like, or do you understand what you want their user experience to be like as you're designing something, right? And those are very different things. One of the things that I love to do is to have somebody take a look at something that I've written who has no idea what I'm writing about, and have them my joke is rip it apart, right? Because many times when I write something, I'm so close to it that I think it's written fine. And when somebody reads it that doesn't have that knowledge level that I do, then they're able to give me more input. And so I think the same applies when we're talking about designing a client experience. And I talk about it as user experience or client experience. What is it like when they go buy your product, right? And they use your store or they go look at your website? What is that teaching them? What is that saying to them? When you've got a shopping cart, understand what it is like when people use that shopping cart, but also when they abandon, why? Why did they abandon? Is there some way that, like, let's say maybe you collected their email address already, but they abandoned their shopping cart? Is there something where you can send an email that says, hey, we noticed you started buying from us, but then you stopped? Is there a reason? Would you please, and I actually don't say, is there a reason? Because that's a yes or no. I would say, I'd love to better understand, or I'm curious if you would be willing to help me understand why you chose to not buy. And again, for the record, you start asking everybody that, and you're going to get a better understanding of what's working and what's not working in your projects. The one thing that I always love to talk about, and I used to do this when I was a consultant back in the days of, collaborative learning and collaborative planning. People get things, all people, whether they have disabilities or not, get things in three different ways. They either learn it verbally, viscerally, or visually. So verbal's very understanding, right? They hear it, or they see it in captions, right? That's your way around that. Visually, they either can see it or they figure out with an alt tag what you're trying to show them, right? But it's the visceral that really connects with people. So, when I'm talking about a chart in a presentation, for example, if I'm giving a presentation and I know I've got a graphic on the screen, I might say something like, in our graphic, we've done X, Y, and Z. And as you can tell, as we start to look at I'm making this up, by the way, but as you can tell, as we start to look at customer demand, we can see that it has grown gradually over the last 5 to 7 years. And before that, it was pretty stagnant. Notice the way that I did that, I just incorporated the graphic into what I was saying. It was just part of my approach, right? Yeah. And it keeps you from having to say things like, now, for those of you who can't see what you're going to be able to see in the right? Just talk about it. And what you'll actually see is there may be somebody who has a learning disability that when you viscerally help them get it, they're going to say, oh my gosh, I get that concept, right?
Yeah.
I think the last piece is start prioritizing this in your 2025 budget. Now, I know you've talked about this a lot as I listen to your podcast, right? So this is not new to your users, but the EU has got regulations that are coming out that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Joe, are basically saying that things need to be accessible by 2025, June, I believe it is. The US is working on a bill that has the 508 refresh because 508 standards have not been updated in so long. And so let's just start right now by prioritizing it in your budget. Put a line item in. And when you're doing it, work with a company. And of course, CurbCut does this, but work with a company that is going to help you systematically and holistically make sure that digital accessibility and access for all to your digital assets is just part of the strategy. It's just part of how you do development or how you do design. It's just, as we like to say, baked in. And my friend Kirk Adams will say, it's much easier to put stuff in something before you've baked it, not after, right? And I apologize to Kirk publicly. I just butchered the analogy, but I think you get the point.
I love that, and that's another visceral way to teach the listeners as well. But yeah, I think I may have heard that analogy before. So it's a bit like when you put chocolate chips in a cookie, or after the fact. It's like, well, you're just going to be mashing them in there. Like, you kind of want them part melted, right?
Yeah, and I think, and actually, I think that was the missing part of my analogy, right? Is it's much easier to put the chocolate chips in the cookie before you've made the cookie. But I think the other piece of this, and I know there's so many people who are focused on compliance, right? And if that's where your digital accessible journey starts, fantastic. I'm going to honor that, right? But don't just do it to be compliant.
Yeah.
Do it because you want to increase your customer base. Do it because you want to make your products or your services connect with all. And most importantly, just because, we can't stay in business unless we're doing it. Do it because you want to increase your bottom line.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah. I think it can be that simple, and it's a shame that it's not seen as that for so many people. I'd love for it to be more organic, and because it is the right thing to do, to be inclusive and to make sure everyone has access to your products and services. But if that's not what floats your boat, or you need to be a box ticker, or you need to increase the bottom line, then there are ways. And I mean, yeah, digital accessibility touches on all of that. So
it's funny you say that, Joe, because I've had 4 people that have tried to sell me something in the past month. I'm VP of business development, right? So I get a lot of phone calls and conversations around how can we help you lead generate, right? Generate more leads and stuff. And of course, I'm new in my position, so I wanted to do my due diligence and make sure we weren't, ignoring software. The number of 3 out of those 4 people, when they're selling to someone who works for a digital accessibility company. It's really not that hard to believe that my first question was going to be, is your product accessible? Right.
Yeah.
And 3 out of the 4 people said to me, well, you don't understand. Disabled people really don't represent a lot of the people that we work with. And so this is just not a high priority to me.
Wow.
And I was so, this literally happened to me this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, right? Sometimes you have to be Mr. Educator, and it's so frustrating all the time to do that.
Yeah.
And I remember this is 3 people out of 4 people that I had met with that week had said this to me. And I thought in my head, what's wrong with you? Right. And so I had to be very careful, because as you start to have this happen more and more, you're like, what's wrong with you? And the minute that you take that approach, and this goes back to advice that I would give an end user, it's not that there is something wrong with the other person. It's that they don't understand. Yeah. It's that they're not, either you haven't done a good job of helping them understand, or they're just not going to get it. And so I always live my life saying, what could I have done better to help that person on their journey? Right. And so that also means, by the way, it's really hard for me to walk away sometimes and be like, nope, you're just not going to get it. Right? But our job is to help people get it. And the more we can remember that sometimes it's just about education, sometimes just about showing people, right? Different things are going to connect, but what will always connect when it comes to accessibility is we're improving your bottom line. And any CEO who ignores that statement probably isn't going to get it.
Yeah, definitely. It's that awareness, and that, yeah, exactly, amazing. Cool. So, I mean, I've taken up a lot of your time, Jeremy, over the last couple of weeks and today. So, it brings me to final thoughts. So, I always like to give an opportunity to our guests to share something of importance to you at the moment, either within accessibility in your job or just events that you have coming up, or something in your own personal life you'd like to share.
So I really thought very hard about this. There's a story, and I should have looked this up last night because I don't want to butcher it, but on the back of the US dollar, it's either the seal or the pyramid that's unfinished. I can't remember which one, and I apologize for that. But one of them's unfinished. And it's unfinished because when we were put together as a country, we were unfinished. And I've always kept that back in my head, right? That's the political side. We're supposed to debate and learn from each other in order to, grow as a country. But I've always kind of had that philosophy in my own head. We can always do better. My own story has been always, how can I do better? Right? There's not, there's never been a time in my life where I've just been like, okay, that's great. I'm fine. Right. I'm always thinking about how can we do it better. Even my own journey of learning in the world of digital accessibility actually had nothing to do with I want to learn about accessibility. It was more how can I learn how to remove the barriers that are in front of me. Right.
Mm.
How can and so the idea that I ended up in the digital accessibility space is fascinating to me because that wasn't my intent. My intent was just to learn enough that I could do in order to fix my own problems, right?
Yeah.
So that I could, but I bring that same curiosity that I just advised people to bring to the digital accessibility journey, right?
Yeah.
And I think if we all approach it from learning and we all approach it with curiosity and we all approach it with increasing understanding, how can we do better, then together within the field of digital accessibility we can overcome these barriers of accessibility for all people. And once we start doing that, then as a field we're going to start to increase those year over year improvements. And let's be honest, as a field we're making 1 to 2% improvements a year. That is not fast enough and it is not holistic enough. And
Mm.
so I'm just honored that I'm working for a company and working with partners who really want to focus on moving that to a higher percentage and removing the barriers that exist for all people. And one of the things that I actually love about CurbCut and the partners that we work with and the clients that we're working with is they get that it's not just about someone who's blind or it's not just about someone who's deaf, but it's about removing barriers of access for everyone.
Yeah.
And as we start to move into building a 21st century world, that's critical. It is
Yeah.
absolutely critical.
Oh, I love it. And yeah. Oh my God. Like Jeremy, I have adored this conversation and all of our conversations. You are such a great guy. And not just because you've given me your time, just in general. It's always a laugh. It's always great talking to you. I'm surprised we've made it through without swearing, so that's good. Thank you for that. Um, considering the topic as well.
I do have my moments, Joe. I have my moments.
We all do, don't you worry.
Hmm.
But no, thank you so much for joining me on the episode. I know that you've got your own stuff coming soon as well, with potential podcast coming up, which would be great. So we'll definitely plug that wherever we can. Um, CurbCutOS sounds amazing, and the work that you're all doing over there. I really hope that this reaches some more clients for you, and it'd be great to hear if that's been able to happen.
Uh,
Just wish you every success.
Well, I appreciate that, Joe, and you have been doing some amazing work at PCR Digital. I'm really excited about the holistic approach that you bring to the recruiting you're doing, and even to the podcast episodes that I've listened to. So it's an honor to be with you. We'll definitely make sure that there's contact information in there for me, but I will also. I look forward to you being a guest on the CurbCutOS podcast, which will be launching over the next 2 months, and just all the other stuff that we have coming to fruition. So definitely appreciate your support and what you're doing within the field of digital accessibility, and look forward to this being one of many, many more collaborations.
Oh, I'd love that. Absolutely. If I'm ever over on your side of the pond, then I'll definitely be giving you a call.
I will do the same. That would be so neat.
Love it. Thanks again, Jeremy. Thanks so much.
Thank you.